In the previous episode.
So why are people given this advice to eat every 2 hours? Well, it temporarily circumvents the problem of the glucose plummeting after a meal due to high insulin levels. So if the blood sugar, somebody is having a reactive hypoglycemia episode and the blood sugar goes way down, eat a handful of whatever that has carbs in it and the sugar goes up. So what's happening here is instead of addressing the real cause, the root cause, we're just putting a Band-Aid on it.
Welcome to ReInvent Healthcare, a podcast for health and wellness practitioners passionately committed to transforming our current broken, disease-focused system. Your host, Dr. Rita Marie Los-Calzo, is devoted to helping you get results with complex health challenges like autoimmune, hormonal imbalances, and chronic health challenges caused by nutritional and lifestyle-induced imbalances. Here's your host, Dr. Rita Marie.
Welcome back to ReInvent Healthcare, the podcast for health and wellness practitioners who are passionate about making a difference. Today's episode dives deep into the science and clinical application of intermittent fasting and the important considerations for women, especially those who are still cycling. Our guest today is Cynthia Thurlow, a nurse practitioner, an international speaker with, get this, over 10 million views on her second TEDx talk about intermittent fasting. And she's the author of the book, Intermittent Fasting Transformation. She's also the CEO and founder of the Everyday Wellness Project. With over 20 years of experience in health and wellness, Cynthia is a globally recognized expert in intermittent fasting and nutritional health and has been featured on ABC, Fox 5, KTLA, CW, Medium, Entrepreneur, and The Megyn Kelly Show. She was listed in Yahoo Finance as one of the 21 founders changing the way we do business. Cynthia hosts the Everyday Wellness Podcast, considered one of the 21 podcasts to expand your mind in 2021 by Business Insider. Her mission is to educate women on the benefits of intermittent fasting and overall holistic health and wellness so they feel empowered to live their most optimal lives. Today, we're going to discuss intermittent fasting and provide you with strategies you can incorporate with your patients and clients to get great results and guidelines to be sure those you're working with are good candidates for intermittent fasting. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thanks. It's so nice to be here with you.
It's so exciting to have you here, and I'm so excited about your book and all the work that you're doing to help women. I know that intermittent fasting has become mainstream. 35 years ago, when I did the first of my extended fasts, the longest being 28 days, I was considered a bit of a nutcase and an extremist. And 12 years ago, when I first started teaching intermittent fasting to participants in a blood sugar balancing program, the Sweet Spot Solution, intermittent fasting hadn't gone mainstream yet. I find it to be super important strategy for metabolic health and overall wellness. And now, with the help of podcasts and TED Talks like yours, just about everybody I know knows about intermittent fasting. It's so cool.
It really is. And I love that it's been part of your lifestyle and the work that you've been doing with patients for a long, long time.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. And like if you mention intermittent fasting at the grocery store, most people know what you're talking about, which is, it's just amazing. And most people have tried it, at least. So it's really cool. And so I know you have a definition of intermittent fasting you mentioned in your book, and I want to talk about that. What is really intermittent fasting?
Well, I think the word fasting really gets a bad rap. I think it can be fairly triggering for the average American who's eating food 6 to 10 times a day by a recent research study by Sachin Panda. So when I'm talking to my patients or my clients about fasting, it's really eating less often. And that makes it much more approachable and much more of a strategy that people can wrap their heads around, as opposed to feeling like it's incredibly restrictive. So fasting could be as simple as eating dinner and then not eating again until breakfast the following day. But as you know, most, if not all, Americans are eating around the clock from the moment they get up to the moment they go to bed. And so this can seem in some ways very revolutionary, but as we both know, is much more aligned with ancestral health perspectives and certainly much more aligned with the way our bodies are designed to thrive, as opposed to nowadays we have this climate of metabolic inflexibility, metabolic disease, and meal frequency definitely plays a role in that.
Yeah, I totally love that definition of eating less frequently. That can be going from eating 6 times a day to 5 times a day. And, the further on with that, and it's less threatening than the concept of fasting, right? People get really scared about fasting. So let's talk about the benefits of intermittent fasting, especially from a clinical perspective. I know that in your book, you talk about hormone balancing, gut health, weight loss, and a whole lot more. So let's dig into how intermittent fasting actually works to restore balance. There's a lot of aspects of the body where it works for.
Yeah, and I think that most people become curious about intermittent fasting in terms of body change, wanting to change body composition, wanting to lose weight. But as I remind people, there's so much more to it than that. And I think it really starts from improved mental clarity, which is a direct reflection of lowered insulin levels. We know that when our insulin levels are low and we're able to actually tap into fat stores for energy, it allows our body to free up a specific type of ketone, a beta hydroxybutyrate, and this diffuses across the blood-brain barrier, which is one of many reasons why we have this tremendous mental clarity. So that's always a first one that for many people is incredibly surprising. Number 2 is that while we're in a non-fed state, we are tapping into a scientific principle called autophagy. And this is this waste and recycling process in the body. And when we're eating, this really largely gets is put on hold. And so when we're in a non-fed state, our body's able to go in and get rid of disease, disordered organelles, mitochondria, and get rid of them. And I remind people that when we're in this chronically, habitually overfed state, that it definitely contributes to, the potentiality for diseases, disorders, and even the potential for cancer with these disorganized cells. So number 2 is autophagy. I think about the reduction in inflammation because, again, we're getting a better balanced blood sugar, glucose as well as insulin. When glucose is up, insulin is also up. And I remind people that if you're chronically overeating and your blood sugar is trying to manage and mitigate this onslaught of caloric intake, those insulin levels, when they're up, it doesn't allow us to, use fat as a stored fuel. It's really just using it to store the added fuel, extra fuel that's laying around. We know that there's a lot of benefits with biophysical markers, things like blood pressure, blood sugar, lipid panels, inflammatory markers, all of which improve when someone is eating less often. I think about the reduction in risk for neurologic disorders, including Alzheimer's, which we now really think of as type 3 diabetes, certainly more problematic as people get older. And I like to remind women in particular that we are largely protected from a lot of the cognitive disorders until we go into menopause. So we know that estrogen can be an insulin sensitizing hormone. And so important for people to understand there's an added responsibility to really be taking good care of our metabolic health as we go from cycling to non-cycling. So just acknowledging that there are a lot of benefits beyond just the body composition changes that a lot of people really choose to focus on. But I remind them it's so much more than that. The mental clarity, the autophagy, the reduction in inflammation in the body, certainly the improvement in our risk factors for developing certain types of cancer, neurologic disorders is really a good starting point. And then lastly, I would also argue, in many ways, the basis for most chronic disease in the United States and westernized countries is insulin resistance. And so insulin resistance is at the basis for a lot of things that we probably were not taught in school. I know I certainly wasn't taught that insulin resistance was at the basis for most male and female factor infertility, polycystic ovarian syndrome, certainly high blood pressure, hypertension. A lot of these chronic health diseases that we think of are really an issue with insulin resistance. And so really re-emphasizing how critically important it is, especially given, a lot of the recent statistics. I think there was a 2018 study from UNC Chapel Hill really speaking to the fact that 88.2% at that time were metabolically unhealthy. And I know that number is probably started to creep closer to 90 given the last 2 years. So really, it's a strategy that nearly anyone can successfully utilize to improve their metabolic health. And I would argue after almost 20 years of working in cardiology, given the fact that, we're heading in this direction where things are not getting better in terms of our health biophysical markers, that it's something that all clinicians should be talking to their patients about.
I totally agree with you. In fact, we talked about that on our first show, about that 88%. And I think that was back in whatever it was, 2018. So yeah, I agree with you that since what's happened over the last couple of years, it's probably worse. It's probably closer to 90%. And that's really a sad and sorry statistic because people aren't addressing it, right? They're not addressing their insulin resistance until they go to the doctor and get a test and they go, oh, look at that. Your fasting blood sugar is here. So you have this problem. But the thing with intermittent fasting is we can address this much sooner before it becomes a disease, right? So I want to dig into the hormones, right? We mentioned a little bit about estrogen, but in your book, I loved you explored of course, the ones we think about, insulin and glucagon and growth hormone and appetite hormones like leptin and ghrelin, but you also mentioned oxytocin and estrogen that are impacted, well, actually positively influenced by intermittent fasting. So I'd love to hear about that, and then we can maybe flow into some special considerations for women.
Yeah, oxytocin is really not thought about enough, but yet it is a hormone that is a bonding hormone. It's a hormone that makes us feel good. You think about it when babies are bonding with their moms and they're breastfeeding, and that flow of oxytocin makes you feel really bonded to your infant. I think about just hugging your loved ones. We've been 2 years into a situation where a lot of us haven't been able to get together with family and friends. The need for physical attachment, whether it's to a dog, a cat, a human, your spouse, your significant other, your children, all really important. What's interesting about oxytocin is you need hits of it throughout the day, meaning it isn't just one hug that's going to suffice for your oxytocin needs. Yeah. But we recognize how important it is for our mental health, for our physical health, how it interplays with our sex hormones, estradiol, which is the predominant form of estrogen prior to going through menopause, progesterone, testosterone, as well as many other hormones. And so I encourage people to find ways to bring joy into your life. It could be as simple as something that brings you joy is getting outside and walking outside every day for 10 or 15 minutes, or reading a good book, or connecting with a loved one over the phone if you're not able to see them in person, really creating opportunities throughout your day so that you get that, that influx of oxytocin, which makes us feel good, makes us feel great, which explains why, there are people out there that have many, many children because they love that baby stage because it's so deliciously oxytocin rich. With that being said, also speaking about estradiol, which is the predominant form of estrogen, there's actually three main types of estrogen. Estrone is the predominant form of estrogen that we find in menopausal women, but estradiol is the one that most of us think of when we're thinking of estrogen and its role within the body. And I think, unfortunately, given our, and I don't know how else to put it, hedonistic lifestyles where we have access to everything 24/7, whether it's food or movies or, just having direct access to anything in the world almost instantaneously, that also has encouraged an environment where we're exposed to endocrine disrupting chemicals, not only in our food, but our environment and our personal care products. And so I always say estrogen is grossly underappreciated because we just don't realize what happens when it's not properly balanced. In fact, I would argue, I was just interviewing someone for the podcast a few weeks ago talking about water and how, and this is tangential, but worth mentioning, that most municipal water supplies don't filter out hormones. So when someone takes synthetic hormones like oral contraceptives, et cetera, and they urinate in the toilet, it gets flushed into the water supply, and that's not filtered out. So we are all exposed to synthetic estrogens on a pretty frequent basis. So it's something that we all need to be concerned about. And especially when we're speaking in the context of balancing hormones and eating less often. And so I like people to also understand that estrogen is, found in fat tissue. So, if people are dealing with, being overweight or obese, they have more estrogen rich tissue. And so if they lose weight, and certainly if they are losing weight or changing body composition with intermittent fasting, they are oftentimes improving their estrogen balance in their body. And like I mentioned before, most of us are getting far more synthetic and endocrine disrupting type estrogen chemicals even if we aren't intending for that to be the case. So, one of the things that I find so beneficial about fasting in general is that when we're looking at, balancing hormones and looking at the interrelationship between insulin, which I've already mentioned, the insulin sensitivity, goes along with having adequate and appropriate levels of estrogen. It's important to also talk about how when we're dealing with, insulin sensitivity improvement, we should be getting the byproduct of that should be, improved estrogen levels. And more often than not, when I'm speaking to perimenopausal, menopausal women, they're really dealing with too much estrogen. So that can be tackled for many different ways. But one of them is eating with less frequency. So you have better balanced blood sugar, better balanced insulin, more insulin sensitivity with the mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the cells, and then digging a little deeper to look at the other, transient ways that we're getting the non-beneficial types of synthetic estrogen into our life and cleaning those things up as well.
Wow, there's a lot there, a lot to unpack. And we think about, so here's the thing that most women, as they go through menopause, they're not thinking about balance, but they're thinking not enough estrogen.
Yeah. And I think there's so much misinformation. I certainly finished my nurse practitioner program at the time the Women's Health Initiative research was shared in the medical community and certainly with the media. And the more I learn, the more frustrated I become because I think there's been a whole litany of misinformation that's been shared within, the media, which has led people to be fearful about even the utilization of bioidenticals. And for every person that's listening, that really is very much an N of one, very much a bio-individual decision that you and your healthcare team need to make together. But I think there's been so much misinformation that's been shared about bioidenticals and to the point where there are very appropriate times where people do need some hormonal support and they're fearful to use it. I've had women cry to me because they're so fearful of even taking progesterone or testosterone or any type of thyroid replacement. And to me, I think we've really done women a tremendous disservice. But I think first and foremost, the lifestyle piece, and that's something I know that we're very aligned on. Lifestyle medicine is really the first step. It's not starting with hormones as an aside. It's really looking at the choices we make in terms of sleep and stress management and nutrition and meal frequency and the right types of exercise that are going to do more for our hormones than just focusing solely on pharmaceutical options. And they do play a role for many people, but I also think that's not the starting point. And I think that's largely a departure from a lot of my peers. But I do find you have to do the foundational work before you can even think about adding in medication if that's indeed what someone needs.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. And I think that there's been an over-reliance on pharmaceuticals. And yeah, they save lives. Yes, give somebody that can change their life to have bioidenticals. But if they're still eating Cheetos and drinking Coke, it's not going to have the same impact, right? And we really, the whole concept that you stress over and over in the book is it's not just what we eat, it's when we eat. And that's where intermittent fasting really makes a difference. I see people who are eating beautiful food, lots and lots of green leafy vegetables and fruits and nuts and lean meats that are organically raised and whatnot, but they're eating all day long. And it's impossible to have metabolic flexibility, to have good metabolic health when you're flooding your system with insulin all day long. So I'm right on.
And it's interesting to me that when you really reflect, if you ask people how they feel when they're eating frequently, they don't feel great. It's that classic carbohydrate burner that, has slumps in their energy and they don't realize it's not normal to want to take a nap after a meal. I always say to my husband, if I ever need to take a nap after a meal, it is a sure sign that I got my macros, kind of askew. And I'm pretty conscientious, but I remind people that most people walk around being chronically tired with energy slumps and they deal with weight loss resistance. And I said, those are always signs that your macros and your meal frequency is really off. So a lot of it's this retraining that everything I learned as a clinician about, 3 meals a day and snacks and heart healthy grains and so much that I learned even at a big research institution that I now have to untrain people around and really support them. And I know you do this as well, really retraining people's mindset about the nutrition that they're eating along with the meal frequency.
Absolutely. And that's the thing that gets overlooked a lot. I was listening to an audiobook just a couple of days ago and about this great stuff. And then you can have a snack. And I'm like, no, don't tell them to have snacks. It's not the way to go. You mentioned about, we talked about estrogen and oxytocin, and we think about estrogen and oxytocin as female hormones, although, males do have them as well. But what are some of the considerations for women? You especially talk about women who are cycling and different times when they shouldn't be fasting versus when they should be fasting. And I just really want our practitioners out there to know how to use intermittent fasting judiciously and to counsel people about the right timing, so to speak, of intermittent fasting, especially cyclically.
No, it's such a good question. And this is where I think a lot of the fear mongering goes on social media and abroad about, whether or not it's dangerous for women or women shouldn't employ intermittent fasting. And I always say we wouldn't be here as a species if that were the case, because the concept of famine, feasting and famine is something that's part of our entire species and our evolution. Yeah. But first and foremost, when we're looking at a lean 30-something woman at her peak fertile years, that's very different than a middle-aged woman, even one who's still cycling, that is obese and needs to lose weight. So, first and foremost, if you have a very lean patient or you yourself are very lean, I don't like to see people doing prolonged fasts. If you're already lean, I think there's the law of diminishing returns. You have to be careful. And I remind people that our menstrual cycle really is a barometer for our health. And if you're fasting and, maybe for a cycle or two, your menstrual cycle gets a little lighter, a little heavier, or goes away, that can be a sign that it's too much of a stressor. And the term hormetic stress is something that I use alongside intermittent fasting, meaning the right stress in the right amount at the right time. I don't like fasting for women the week preceding their menstrual cycle. It's just a time when, the luteal phase is a special time. It's when progesterone, for the most part, predominates. It's not the time to be restricting your food. People can certainly do 12-hour fasts. I don't have a problem with that. But also leaning into not fasting while you're pregnant, not fasting while you're breastfeeding. There's conversations that I've had with other leading experts, lots of physician researchers, and we talk about the potential for epigenetic changes if you are in a state of caloric deficit, significant caloric deficit. So just something to think of. And I do see a lot of the fit pros on social media that like to talk about how they've been able to intermittent fast through all their pregnancies and they wear it like a badge of honor. Really not a time to be restricting your macros. And then, the other piece is, jokingly, women that are middle-aged that get stuck, that aren't sleeping, they desperately want to lose weight. And if they're not sleeping, the first thing I say to them is, if you aren't sleeping through the night, I can't get you to lose weight. So sleep really is foundational. And I would be the first person to say, irrespective of whether you're still cycling, perimenopausal, menopausal, if you're not sleeping, work on that first. And then, slowly integrate utilizing fasting as an opportunity. Some of the general contraindications that I think about are things like if you have a disordered relationship with food. So if you have a history of bulimia, anorexia, or binge eating, unless you are working with a very talented eating disorder specialist who has agreed that you are in a position where you can successfully do this. And I know there are always exceptions, but I find for a lot of people, it can be very triggering to try to restrict their food intake. So that's number one. I think about people who are just too thin. Like there are plenty of them out there. People with a BMI less than 18 or 19, probably not the appropriate time to be fasting. And I'm very transparent about 3 years ago, I spent 13 days in the hospital, lost 15 pounds. I'm not a very big person. And it took me months to be able to get back to a healthy weight where I could even attempt to fast because I had lost so much weight. I think about people that have chronic illnesses. Chronic illnesses could have significant liver, kidney disease, cardiovascular disease. It's not that it's a true contraindication, and there are certainly lots of people who have been able to heal their bodies from chronic disorders. I just think it's always important to have a conversation with your healthcare professional. And I do find more and more now, more healthcare providers of different backgrounds are now very receptive. I think it's important to be checking in if you're on diabetes medications because you may need adjustments in your medication. Same thing with blood pressure medication, really just having that conversation. And lastly, I'm not a fan of fasting for children or teenagers. They're still growing, really not appropriate. I did, however, during that talk that you mentioned in the very beginning, I got slammed because I mentioned not fasting after the age of 70. And you have to believe that every outlier 70-year-old reached out to me and made sure they understood they did not appreciate me putting an age on there. So if someone's frail, if someone's debilitated, if someone has brittle diabetes, or they've recently been hospitalized, probably not the best time to add in that stressor. But for most other people, in most instances, I do see tremendous value. And I think even if people are fasting 3 days a week, that's 3 days that they are tapping into autophagy, getting their insulin levels down, and really benefiting metabolically. And that's really the place that I come from, is a place of love and really wanting people just to be healthier so that they can go on to spend more time with their loved ones, be able to, provide more to their community, be in a position where they're going to have a happier, healthier lifestyle.
Absolutely. Wow. So I want to ask this. This is a good time to clarify. There's different kinds of intermittent fasting, right? Well, there's fasting and there's extended fasting. But when we're talking intermittent fasting, you talk a lot about that in the book, the different kinds of fasting regimes. So when you say, like, somebody who's underweight, they shouldn't be fasting, I certainly see that they should not be going a whole day without eating and that kind of thing. So are you still thinking? So first of all, explain the various types and your experience with them and what you find to be most effective, if there's one. Maybe it just varies from person to person. And then if we're talking somebody who is in the luteal phase, or are you saying they shouldn't be doing like a 16 hours, 8 hours kind of window, or that they just shouldn't be doing longer fasts? So I know there's a whole bunch of stuff built into that, but I want to really clarify for people as they're listening.
Yeah, no, so the 16-8 is a good benchmark for people to aspire to. If they're new to fasting and they're looking to, start from maybe a 12-hour fast, they go from dinner to breakfast, that's a great starting point. You will still get benefits predominantly of digestive rest, of not eating so frequently. So let's be very clear that you're still doing benefits, but you really want to work to, it's like a muscle. You want to work the muscle out so that you are working it over a period of time. So you're developing skill sets. So the goal is to go 16 hours fasted, but many people start with 12 and they slowly open up that window. In the case of someone that is in the luteal phase, I don't want them fasting more than 12 hours a day. I have people who will argue with me all over social media because that's not what they want to do. And I just said, well, this is based on the research and working with thousands of patients, and this is my best recommendation. And inevitably, they'll get 3 or 4 days before their menstrual cycle starts, and they literally cannot wait to break their fast. They're so fixated on food. And I said, because the luteal phase is when your body actually needs a little bit more macros anyway. That is not a byproduct of me waving a wand. That is physiologically what your body is looking for, because it hasn't been able to distinguish whether or not it is fertilized an egg and getting ready to start a pregnancy, or if you're going to start menstruating in a couple of days. So the body is not differentiating at that point. Now, I think that there are many types of fasting. There is types of fasting where people just fast twice a week. There are long fasts, 24, 36, 72, 4 to 5 day fasts. My book predominantly focuses on the 16-8 because that is an achievable outcome for most people to work towards. And so I am a big fan of people fasting on a daily basis, because there are so much benefits when it becomes part of your lifestyle, as opposed to, there are 2 days out of the week where I'm going to fast for 24 hours, or there are 2 days out of the week that I'm going to consume 500 or 600 calories. That is much harder for me personally to do. Mm-hmm. I like to exist in the space where I know there's a black and white area. This is the time when I fast. This is the time when I eat. So when I'm teaching people how to go from 3 meals a day and snacks to going to fasting, that seems very overwhelming. But I encourage them to think about it as baby steps, slow and steady wins. So every step forward is getting closer to that goal, being very clear about what their goals are, so that when they feel like they're really struggling, they can say, okay, the reason why I'm doing this is I want to get off of X medication. The reason why I'm doing this is I want to get healthy enough to be able to chase after my children. And when you can reflect on those goals, it makes it much, much easier to subjugate a temporary desire to break your fast early. Obviously, I don't encourage anyone to walk around being hungry and miserable, but there are so many strategies you can use to blunt your hunger cravings in a way that's beneficial for the body. I'll give you one example. There are polyphenols, there are compounds in bitter tea and coffee that will help blunt hunger cravings. And so that's an important distinction. I don't tell people to drink coffee or green tea or black tea while fasted just because. I'm doing it because there's actual physiologic benefits from consuming these polyphenols. So getting back to your original intent, there are a lot of different windows for when people are in a fed or a fasted state. But I think it's easiest for people initially to start with consistency. And then when they are consistent and they are fully fat adapted, then you can get creative. Like in the book, I talk about a lot of different variations, but the creativity comes after you have mastered the basics.
I agree with that so totally. And having that predictability, because there is an adaptation period. So if you're going to just do 16/8 twice a week, those 3 days in between, you get adapted and then you have to readapt to the period of not eating. And I think I agree with you that I like to help people to find their ideal fasting window. And so for some people it might be shorter, for some people it might be longer. What do you find, do you see a big difference between 16 hours of fasting versus 18 versus 20? Because I know a lot of people are how they are, they get competitive. Oh, I got to 16, now I got to get to 20. Now how many hours did you fast? So is there really a benefit to going longer, or does it actually just make people more crazy and hungry and want to eat more when they actually sit down to eat?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things at play. There are definitely people who have a competitive nature and they're going to push the envelope, and they're always extremists in every, strategy that you look at. Obviously, the longer you fast, the more you're pushing autophagy, the more, growth hormone secretion you get. But I think it's always in the context of what are your goals. Now, for me personally, after spending 13 days not being able to eat, I haven't done any really long fasts since then, and I may never do really long fasts again. I don't do more than a 24 or 30-hour fast because it brings back some trauma of being in the hospital. But I do have people that wear it like a badge of honor. If 2 days makes them feel great, then they want to push to 4. And I always ask them, what is the purpose? Some people like the spirituality aspects of longer fasts. They feel very connected to their sense of purpose. They feel connected to God or whatever they identify with in the universe. Some people, they really like to push the envelope and they just want to, set another goal for themselves. As long as they're not hurting themselves and they're sleeping and they feel good and their energy is fine and their cycle isn't totally messed up, I think that's reasonable and feasible. But I always think in the context of when you're looking at the benefits, when you're looking at stem cell activation, when you're looking at gut rest, when you're looking at, digestive rest, some people need to fast a little longer to get more of those benefits. There's always the clarification pieces of, clean fasting versus dirty fasting versus what's bulletproof coffee versus what Dave Asprey, who I like Dave. But Dave sometimes, throws things out there, and then I'm getting challenged on social media about that as well. And I always say it's always in the context of, are you a standard American diet eater who's a couch potato? Or are you someone who's been physically active and is a healthy weight? You may need to start fasting very differently. And there's nothing wrong with training wheels, as I call them, if someone needs to, add MCT oil as an example, because they're really struggling just to get to 13 hours because they are so carb addicted and they've been eating a standard American diet, and even asking them to walk for 15 minutes a day seems overwhelming, might be very different than someone who's already fat adapted, pretty healthy, and can effortlessly and easily get to 18 hours. So first and foremost, I do like variety. I do encourage variety after people have the basics, but the comparisonitis that is exacerbated being on social media, where again, people wear, whatever they show I've been fasting for 36 hours and they want to screenshot their app. I think that's great. Some people really need that accountability, but there are just as many other individuals who then feel inadequate and they wonder what's wrong with them. And so I just say, stay in your lane, do what works best for you. Don't compare yourself to anyone else. I'm as guilty of this as anyone else. When I start having days like that, I'm like, I just need to get off of social media and I need to focus on my purpose and why I'm doing this and what am I trying to get out of it, so that I am not, going into, I call it like the dwindles of doom. there are people who definitely are very influenced by what they see. And so sometimes it can be influenced in negative ways. And so I remind people, what's your purpose? How did you feel after you were fasting? How was your sleeping? How was your energy? And if you feel great, then you can continue on with maybe doing a little longer fast next time. If you struggled and felt miserable and could not get yourself out of this, negative thinking cycle, then it's a sign it was too much stress on the body. Remember, we talked about hormetic stress, the beneficial stress in the right amount at the right time. Sometimes it's not the right time, and that's okay. Like I can tell you, when I was in Costa Rica with my family at Christmas, I ate like big breakfast, and then I didn't eat till dinner time. And that was a complete change to what my body was accustomed to doing. But we were outside in nature all day long. And I was like, well, I'm definitely not going to stop at lunchtime. So I might as well eat now. And then I'll eat, 8 hours later. And it was great. It worked out fine. I still got my macros in. My feeding window was obviously a little wider than it is normally, but it's good for our bodies to get some variety.
Yeah, I totally get that. And I love the concept of focusing on why you're doing it, because a lot of people like that badge of I'm eating this way, or I'm eating that way, or I'm fasting this way, and not really tuning in to what's happening in their body. And I kind of got into that a couple of years ago. I decided I was going to do a 5-day fast once a month. And for the most part in 2019, I did it. I think I did 10 5-day fasts, which is crazy, right? I am not overweight. But I was like, I got to do this because I said I was going to do it. Oh, is it time to do it again? Okay, I'm going to do it. And finally, in 2020, I think I might have done like 2 5-day fasts the whole year because I just couldn't bring myself to do it. My body was saying no. And maybe back in 2019, I needed it and it was a good cleanse. But by the time that next year rolled around, I just had to tune into what my body really needed and wanted. And it said, no, thank you. We don't want to do this as much anymore.
And that's okay. I mean, that's the big thing is I think all of us do different things at different time periods. And, for me, obviously I've been fasting not as long as you, but I've been fasting for 5 or 6 years. And for me, lately, I've been finding that I don't want to fast until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So naturally, my body wants to eat around 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, and I eat. And I've just come to find out I actually end my feeding window earlier than I used to. I really am following chronobiology. So I eat when it's light out and I don't eat when it's dark out. And I sleep better. And I track all of my Oura Ring data. And I remind women, especially middle-aged women, the Oura Ring, and I have no affiliation with them. Let me be very clear. Yeah. I love knowing how much REM and deep sleep I'm getting. And I can completely correlate it with eating later in the day, getting too much light exposure in the evening, completely messes up my sleep. And so I have gotten very, very diligent about breaking my fast earlier, eating earlier in the day, ending my feeding window before it gets dark, before it really gets dark out, and I'm sleeping a whole lot better. So I encourage people to really experiment to find out what works best for you and your lifestyle. And it might be seasons. Like you mentioned in 2019, you did a lot of longer fasts. And then 2020, you didn't want to do as many longer fasts. So don't force anything. I'm not a believer in self-flagellation. Like if you don't want to do something, don't force yourself to do it.
Exactly. Yeah, I have 2 more questions and then we'll end. I know I could go on and talk to you for hours and hours and hours about this stuff, but two more questions. One, thyroid, right? So many people, mostly women, are suffering from thyroid imbalance. It's like an epidemic. And so there's a lot of talk about thyroid imbalances and should we intermittent fast? Should we fast? What does it do to the thyroid hormone? So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, it gets a bad rap. And for full disclosure, I had an underactive thyroid, probably mild Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune disorder, which is the bulk of people with Hashimoto's have, the bulk of people with hypothyroidism have Hashimoto's, like almost 85 to 90%. So it wasn't fasting that caused that. And it's more common to see that in middle-aged women for a multiplicity of reasons. I have come to believe, and when I talk to thyroid experts, they agree that it can actually improve the quality of your mitochondria because you're getting rid of this, you're getting rid of the disease disordered cells. With that being said, I think it's critically important that people are checking in with themselves. Now, if you fast and you have energy and you sleep and you feel good and you eat an anti-inflammatory diet, etc., great. if you have a thyroid issue and you're not sleeping, you're gaining weight, you don't feel good, you can't get through a workout, you're not eating an anti-inflammatory diet, probably not the right time to add in fasting. But I do have lots of patients that will tell me that they feel so significantly better eating less often, even with thyroid health issues, that they try their hardest to make sure that they're really dialing in on the lifestyle pieces so they can continue doing it successfully. And I can tell you, after looking at thousands of people's labs, more often than not, when we can get their sex hormones better aligned, when we can get their insulin and their glucose better aligned, the thyroid will fall into place. Like, one thing that the pearl that I always remembered when I was a new nurse practitioner was, if you see thyroid issues, make sure they're not insulin resistant and don't treat cholesterol problems until you get the thyroid back in line. So if anyone's listening and they have thyroid issues and they're insulin resistant, well, they all play a role in together. I mean, the endocrine system is this beautiful symphony of hormones, but if one is out of whack, so is another. And I think it's really important for people to understand that. I find for a lot of people, when they clean up the insulin resistance or they improve their blood sugar stability, oftentimes the thyroid will improve as well. And so I think that's important. Number two is, if you're working with someone on thyroid health, ensuring that they're doing a proper thyroid labs, that they're not just looking at a TSH and a free T4 and sending you on your merry way, because there's a lot of subtleties with thyroid. Mm-hmm. And I think this is probably one of the least I don't want to be super critical of my allopathic peers. However, I think this is one of those areas where I know myself as a clinician working in cardiology, unless you were dying of thyroid storm or myxedema coma, we didn't really worry about thyroid. We left that to the internal medicine docs, the hospitalists. But how many opportunities were missed with patients who probably had subclinical hypothyroidism and they were clearly hypothyroid and they weren't being treated and they felt terrible and they were cold, they were constipated, their hair was falling out. They had all these menstrual irregularities. So make sure you're working with someone who can look at the thyroid comprehensively and not just do 2 labs and tell you that you're fine. Because had I not had a really good clinician when my thyroid started acting up, I probably would have been one of those people walking around like a zombie, which is what I saw a lot of 40-ish-year-old women doing, was that they were so undertreated for their thyroid and no one was willing to give them a lifeline. It's like a terrible analogy, but they weren't willing to send them a little SOS to get there. Maybe, sometimes it could be something specific that can impact the thyroid, but really important for people to understand that there's this whole interrelationship between our entire endocrine system. We have thyroid receptors on every cell. And I think it's really, really important for people to understand that you can fast successfully with thyroid issues, provided that they're stable and provided that you're sleeping and, eating an anti-inflammatory diet. I think it can absolutely be done.
Great. That's great to hear. And those who, my practitioners that I train, we don't teach them just to do 2 labs on thyroid. Mm-hmm. It's a full panel. And so it's super important to address that. And also, that's the other thing I teach, is that if you've got somebody with thyroid imbalance and you don't address the insulin resistance that's there, the thyroid's never going to heal. So I love all that you shared. Last question, I promise you. I just want to clarify window. So 16-hour fasting window, 8-hour feeding window. Is it as effective if somebody starts eating at the beginning of the 8-hour window and kind of munches their way through to the end of it versus having 2 distinct or 3 distinct meals in that window?
Oh, well, I think you know my answer to this. I don't like snacking. And so each time you're eating, and if you're secreting insulin throughout the day in response to food, you are going to shut down some of the key physiologic processes that we talked about. Like autophagy is a good one. I remind people that if we want to become metabolically flexible, we have to eat less frequently. So if you're eating from 10 a.m. in the morning till 6 o'clock at night, you're not doing the same kind of benefits to eating at 10, eating at 2, eating at 6. Very important distinction. That meal frequency, the time when we're not eating, I use this one, there's one, the migrating motor complex is like one of these nerdy concepts in the digestive system, but it's an important one for people to understand. It really takes our bodies about 4 to 5 hours in between meals to be able to detoxify, push things forward, address pathogens if we've ingested them. And we knock out the benefits of the MMC if we are eating too frequently. And so it's something that I teach my coaches, even the ones who are not clinicians, to really understand, like, I'm not just saying this because I want to be a party pooper. I'm saying this because I want you to understand why our bodies are not designed to be a dumping ground. Like, it's one thing if you go to a party, you're on a holiday, it's something different. But if that's what you're doing to your body every single day, you're not giving your body an opportunity to break down, detoxify, digest, assimilate the food before you're dumping more food inside your food gullet. That's what one of my professors used to call it, the gullet. Really explaining to people why it's so important. So to reiterate, you are much better off having 2 meals in an 8-hour window or 3. You know, some people are very, very hungry, as opposed to eating from the time you open up your feeding window to the time you end, by the time you end it, because that chronic habitual, it's no different than what the average American is doing. Sugar sweetened beverages and foods throughout the day, which is really detrimental to our health.
Yeah, for sure. We know that. But even if it's good food, it's still not good to just start your eating window, eat and just munch your way through to the end. And I think some people make that mistake and say, oh, intermittent fasting doesn't work for me. I've tried it. I've done that 16-8 thing. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for all your wisdom. And thank you for your podcast and your book and your TED Talks. So we'll have links in the show notes to Cynthia's TED Talks, 2 TED Talks, the book, and there's some good bonuses when you use the link in there to buy the book. And I encourage you to go and check it out, because the work that Cynthia is doing in the world is phenomenal. So before we end, I'd like you to share, what is one thing you want to leave our listeners with, our practitioners, our doctors, nurses, health coaches, etc., with, that will help them to shine in their practices based on this?
Oh. I love that. You know, I think it really, if we are an example to our clients, to our patients, I think it's really important that we are prioritizing sleep, because I know for myself that I can be ready to serve others, not just my family and my community, but to serve others when I've had a good night of sleep. And unfortunately, I was conditioned and came up in a time when you sleep when you're dead. So there was a lot of years of not getting enough high quality sleep. And I think this kind of catches up with you in middle age. So for everyone that's listening, really emphasizing high quality sleep every night and finding hacks to be able to do that, because the better quality sleep you have, the more you can bring into your business, into your patient population, and be able to offer more to others. I just, sleep has become like the new frontier. I just cannot get enough finding out more about sleep and trying to share it with other providers, practitioners, my coaches, so that they can impact more lives.
Thank you. That's so, so valuable. So we've been talking to Cynthia Thurlow. Go check out her Everyday Wellness podcast. We'll have all of her links in there, her new book, The Intermittent Fasting Transformation, and learn about the IF45 program that she put together. And I've got a free download for you on intermittent fasting. It's like a 16 or 18 page, very technical, clinical, geeky kind of handout booklet. And you can get that at reinventhealthcare.com/fasting. And I just keep on. We are here to change the world, and practitioners like Cynthia and all of you have the ability to turn our system from a disease management system into a true healthcare system. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the ReInvent Healthcare podcast. Join the movement of practitioners that are guiding people to actually get well rather than covering up their symptoms. Connect with us at ReInventHealthcare.com to access resources and tools that will empower you to create a thriving health practice.